I've been with ODOT a little over a dozen years. I've been the statewide planning manager, so I created policies for across transportation modes and different topics. And then most recently, I was the manager over active transportation and multimodal investment program. Really excited to be taking on this opportunity, which is both challenging and exciting. But we formed a new climate office. And the reason that we've done that is because we've recognized, and really our frontline staff even has seen a change on our transportation system. We're seeing more wildfires out there, more frequent landslides, especially along our Oregon coast, and flooding in all parts of the state. The picture shown here is in Eastern Oregon along Interstate 84 for recent floodings that we had earlier this year. And as you see in the photo, that these events have major impacts on the transportation system. And more importantly, they have major impacts on people's ability to reach critical services and on the statewide economy. When the roads are closed, people can't get to stores, can't get to houses, goods aren't moving and shipping, so it's affecting the statewide economy. So there's a lot of different impacts that we're seeing from these transportation events. So we formed the Climate Office to help understand what's changing in the climate, what these extreme weather events look like, and how we can adapt and make the system more resilient. We also recognize that transportation is responsible for the highest pollution in the state of Oregon. That greenhouse gas emissions from transportation represent about 40% of all emissions in the state, and really affect our overall air quality from the exhaust on cars and trucks. So this is something that we know we need to address, and we're looking for ways that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and really follow our statewide transportation strategy, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is our way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also to comply with the governor's executive order on climate change that came out earlier this year. The Climate Office is pretty small right now, so we have 4 staff, and really that's around 3 to 4 because we have folks working on other efforts as well. But these are the focus areas of the group. Mitigation and adaptation, like I talked about in the introduction slides, are things that we're focused on, as well as sustainability, and that's making sure that we're really being thoughtful on our consumption of goods, energy, and some of those kinds of resources as well. Focusing first on mitigation, so that's ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. As I mentioned, we have a statewide transportation strategy. That's a roadmap for carbon reductions from transportation in Oregon. It was completed in 2013, and it helps the state to reach its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. It looks at all movements of people on the system, including the movement of people in the air, on the ground, and the movement of freight on all transportation modes. When we looked at ways to reduce emissions, we found that there's no one silver bullet. One of the most effective approaches is trying to affect every mile driven and reducing the carbon footprint there. So vehicle and fuel efficiency is about half of the solution. But again, it's not the only solution. We need conducive land uses so that people are able to walk and bike and use lower carbon modes. We need to have an efficient system. And then we can look at opportunities for pricing the system as well. So it's really a mix of things in order to reduce emissions from transportation. We completed the strategy in 2013, and in 2018, a few years ago, we took a look to see how are we doing. What we found is that we've actually increased emissions in transportation in the short term, with a projected decrease long term, given some of our good land use policies, investments in public transportation, and the like. But there's a significant gap between the statewide transportation strategy vision and where we're heading in the future. So we need to make some changes. A big part of closing that gap is what was laid out by the Governor Kate Brown in early March. So she released Executive Order 2004 on climate, directing several state agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and start to consider climate in all aspects of their business. So for ODOT, there's 3 main specific requirements. The first of which is looking at infrastructure charging needs for electric vehicles. The second is adding a greenhouse gas reduction lens to project selection. So really, how do we think about the impacts of if a project might increase or decrease greenhouse gas emissions? And lastly, to, again, integrate things into everything that we do, how we plan, invest, and consider greenhouse gas emissions. And consistent with the executive order, the Climate Office is really set up to add that greenhouse gas reduction lens to the work we do. And I say lens purposely, that there's a lot of things that the agency has to balance, safety, equity, the economy, but we want to make sure we're explicitly balancing the environment as well and making concerted decisions on trying to reduce emissions and trying to adapt to the changes of climate and weather. So our effort in terms of pursuing other actions is to develop a midterm STS implementation plan. That's, again, the statewide transportation strategy. And that's really a big theme within the executive order overall, is looking at ways to implement the statewide transportation strategy, not only by ODOT, but also the other 4 agencies listed here: Department of Land Conservation and Development, Department of Energy, and Department of Environmental Quality. Those agencies have been meeting for the last 6 months, and we've come up with a joint work program of preliminary actions to pursue in the next 2 years. We recognize, though, that this is a long-term effort, and these are only the tip of the spear in terms of the types of actions that we'll be pursuing in the short term. We've dubbed that initiative Every Mile Counts. We have information on our website and are currently accepting public comments on that effort. So I'll drill in a little bit more to some of the major work efforts by the Department of Transportation as outlined in the executive order. The first of which is the Transportation Electrification Infrastructure Needs Analysis, which we lovingly refer to as TINA. This effort is really to look across the state of Oregon and figure out what charging needs we have for electric vehicles. We're primarily going to focus on light-duty vehicles because we're charged with trying to help achieve the goals in Senate Bill 1044, passed by the Oregon legislature a few years ago. We also will be looking primarily at equity issues, so really understanding what are the barriers for all people to access charging. Are there income barriers? Are there barriers for those who rent? Some of those kinds of topics. And then unique to some of the mitigation actions, which tend to focus on in urban areas, we'll be also paying special attention to charging needs in rural areas. We're seeing higher use of light trucks and SUVs in all parts of the state now, making electric vehicles a more viable option for more rural parts of our state. So we'll be paying particular attention to rural areas as well and how we can enable charging there. To do this work, we will hire a consultant and we'll form an advisory committee. The advisory committee will include representatives from other state agencies, as well as utilities, the private sector, and more. We plan to have at least 3 meetings with this group, and these meetings will be open to the public and we'll have time allotted for public testimony. Information will be provided on our website once we get this work up and running in a couple months. We need to finish this report by June 30th of 2021. And I want to talk a little bit about how this relates to other efforts. So I mentioned earlier the statewide transportation strategy, and it's really a mix of actions. And this action required in the executive order is just one of many that we need to pursue to look at better vehicle and fuel efficiency and to achieve a cleaner future. So there's a number of ongoing works that we're looking at leveraging and combining this work with to have an efficient and strategic approach. There are several statewide committees of state agencies and utilities in the private sector that are working collaboratively together on actions. And that we know that once we complete this study and report, that there'll be other things that we need to pursue. I did mention Every Mile Counts earlier, and again, that's the statewide implementation of the statewide transportation strategy by the 4 state agencies I mentioned earlier. There are actions within that complement this, such as a zero emission vehicle action plan, in which the infrastructure needs analysis will be one input into in terms of agency actions. And then there'll be other pieces as well. The Clean Fuels Program is directed in the executive order, and work by DEQ on looking at cleaner options for freight transportation and heavy trucks. The second big work area directed in the executive order is around adding a greenhouse gas lens to project selection. I'm particularly paying attention to our statewide transportation improvement program, or STIP. So the STIP is where we make our major project decisions. All our large projects go into the STIP, and we now have to consider those impacts of those projects and greenhouse gas emissions. We have a report due June 30th, 2021, similar to the electrification. However, we know that there's going to be decisions made before then, and we want to make sure that we're providing information to help support those and really bring that consideration into fruition sooner rather than later. So the Transportation Commission, starting in summer and fall of this year, will be looking at how it programs funding between certain programs like Fix-It, safety, and multimodal investments. And what we'll be doing is looking at, do those different options increase emissions? Do they keep them relatively flat, or do they decrease emissions? And we'll be providing that information along with other important outcomes that the Commission and agency considers, again, such as health, equity, safety, and the environment is one of those important ones as well. So it's a balance across those topic areas. This work effort, we plan to pair with what I mentioned earlier, the STS midterm implementation plan, and that will be on the next slide where I explain that a little bit more. But what relates from that effort to the requirement in the executive order is that we're not only planning on looking at the STIP and the investment decisions there. We have many other multimodal investment programs where we can consider priorities, we consider how projects are funded in support of helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and look at the pieces overall. So the end objective in this lens that we're adding to project selection is to, as a whole, where we can, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or at least not increase them. Lastly, our big effort is the statewide transportation strategy midterm implementation plan. You may ask, why a midterm implementation plan? We're calling it that because it's the second iteration of an ODOT action plan for the STS. We created one in 2014, the year following completion of the STS, and now this is our second plan. So this is the midterm of the 2050 horizon for the statewide transportation strategy. So these are things that we do plan to do immediately and look into. We'll be developing this plan over the next 6 to 8 months, trying to complete something by early 2021. We'll be sharing information with the Oregon Transportation Commission and having several check-in points with them. And we also plan to engage stakeholders on this effort. As we look towards things to do, we'll look within the categories identified in the statewide transportation strategy. So vehicles and fuels, like I mentioned earlier. We'll take the work and results from electrification needs analysis to figure out what electrification implementation programs we need to pursue and how we need to form partnerships with folks like utilities. We'll look at pricing programs. So again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we'll look at our investment programs beyond the STIP to see how we can adapt the transportation system to climate change, as well as try to reduce our emission reduction profile. We'll look towards pricing programs like the ORIGO, or vehicle miles traveled fee, value pricing and tolling options. So there's a number of things we can consider within each of these categories. Also included on this side is information from Every Mile Counts, that multi-agency work. So there are other things that complement these efforts that we'll be looking again at leveraging. For the operation of the system, we'll look at our construction and maintenance practices, because we not only want to look at how the transportation system is built, but how we build it and what the carbon footprint is of the Department of Transportation overall, and trying to reduce emissions there. Following on the COVID pandemic and the proof of concept of broad-scale telecommuting across the state and within the Oregon Department of Transportation, we'll be looking for ways to continue that longer term to reduce demand on the transportation system, working with employers closely. And then we'll be looking at how can we support investments in low and no emission modes like biking, walking, and public transportation. And then lastly, linking up transportation and land use policies, recognizing the clear nexus between those types of actions, supporting local planning that may be required by the Land Conservation and Development Commission and our sister agency, Department of Land Conservation and Development. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Crook to go over some of the adaptation strategies.
Thanks, Amanda. So as you kind of introduced, the Climate Office is the agency's lead on adaptation, which is all about reducing the vulnerability and increasing the resilience of the transportation system from the impacts of extreme weather and climate change. And some examples of adaptation might be upsizing a culvert, or protecting bridges from higher flood flows. This could also be increasing maintenance in more vulnerable areas. So our work through the Climate Office really helps support the agency's mission to provide a safe and reliable transportation system. Beyond GHG reduction alone, though, Executive Order 2004 also directs agencies to consider and integrate climate change impacts into agency decision making. And our work going forward is going to be really focused on this point. How do we take the information and integrate it into our strategies and how we work across the agency? Ultimately, we really want to be more proactive and less reactive in how we prepare and respond to these hazards. Next slide. Next slide, please. So what are some of the impacts that we're expecting? There's been a series of climate assessment reports that were generated out of Oregon State University, and they've consistently pointed to the same set of climate stressors that have impacts to transportation. These include changes in rainfall, such as more frequent or intense rainfall events that can trigger damaging runoff, flooding, erosion on roadways, and extreme storms can also create more landslides and rockfalls that damage enclosed roads. On the coast, larger storms and higher sea levels are projected to bring more storm surge and coastal erosion and landslides. And higher temperatures and drought can lead to damaging heat and wildfires, which leads to extended road closures to fix debris and down trees and destabilize slopes, which impacts travel across the state. And we've seen this every summer for the last 10 years now. So we're already dealing with these hazards and impacts today, but they are projected to become more frequent and get worse with climate change. Next slide. So the Climate Office partners with others across the agency to conduct climate change related research, risk assessments, and pilot studies. This work helps to provide actionable information around the science, the tools, and the best practices for improving resilience. Our partners have included our region project teams, our maintenance and operations staff, and our various asset programs, such as our Unstable Slopes program, which manages landslides and rockfalls. We also partner with others outside the agency, such as with the Federal Highway Administration and with several other state agencies on this issue. Examples of some of our past work include an adaptation strategy for the agency, which was a high-level look at all of our programs and the climate risks, and several studies on the Oregon coast, including a vulnerability assessment pilot, which included a look at sea level rise and what the future impacts might be on the highway systems. So we've been learning a lot more as we go along, and we've been building off these prior efforts. Next slide. So what do we have upcoming? This year, we are partnering with our ODOT research unit and stakeholders on the Oregon coast for a comprehensive erosion hazard risk assessment for US 101. So this will be looking up and down the coast from Astoria all the way down to Brookings at all of these areas that are currently at risk and other areas that may be at risk in the future from higher sea level rise. And the project will be prioritizing these hotspots and informing the timing and options we have for how we address these hazards. This information will also potentially inform changes to state land use policy regarding shoreline armoring for coastal infrastructure. The other big effort we have kicking off this year is what we like to call our adaptation roadmap. And this is a statewide risk assessment and implementation plan. We'll be working with a consultant to engage across the agency to better understand current risks and where and how we can best address these. We plan to hold workshops in each of our 5 regions and share findings, gather input, and help prioritize actions. The most important outcome of this roadmap is going to be identifying the projects, programs, and investments that are needed to make the system more resilient into the future. Next slide. So shifting gears now, we also manage the sustainability program for ODOT. This program has been active within the agency for over 15 years. It focuses on integrating sustainable practices into agency operations. So we have a sustainability plan, and we track and report on performance measures and lead new initiatives across the agency. Some of our key focus areas are listed here, several of which support our climate goals around GHG reduction. For energy efficiency, we have a partnership with the Energy Trust of Oregon on what's called strategic energy management. And that's really focused on working with staff and the facility managers across the agency to improve energy efficiency in all of our buildings. For fleet, we have a lot of vehicles and we use a lot of fuel. So our fleet services group has done a great job being a leader across the state in using alternative fuels such as biodiesel and renewable diesel. We track and report on water use reductions and conservation actions across the state. And we also report on our materials management and recycling through both procurement activities and our operations, including construction and maintenance. We are also the lead for the Oregon Solar Highway Program. And we have 2 sites up near Portland that's a partnership with the Portland General Electric, and they manage and maintain those sites for us.